Then in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be gone again, this time to Indiana. And what they have asked me to do, that they're having a Bible lectureship at a church called Stop 11 Road in Indiana. That was a post office road, I think. They called Stop 11, and the building is built on that road. And they're asking a bunch of us to come talk about mountains and valleys of the Bible. And they've assigned us different topics. And they want me to talk about a valley. And it's a valley I spoke of not too long ago, the Valley of Gehenna. Remember? Where the fire is not quenched and the worm dieth not. That's the Valley of Gehenna. And so I'm not going to bring that lesson here because I've already covered that not long ago and when our discussion of Mark. But then they wanted me to talk about one of the mountains, and they said, talk about Calvary. Calvary. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'll present a lesson something like this. Only if I were to give it a title, I'd give it the one out on the sign this morning. I'd call it On a Hill Far Away. On a hill far away. Here's how that old song goes. On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. That we glory in the cross. That's what Paul said. I glory in the cross of Christ. But he's glorying in something that was a symbol of shame. For someone to be hung up on a cross to die was a shameful, shameful death. And yet Jesus endured the shame and suffered that. And now the cross is something glorious, isn't it? Jesus made the difference in that. I tell you, our life might be a shame too. We may have lived in such a way that our life is just a shame what we've made of our lives. But we can turn it into something glorious. Jesus can turn our life from something shameful to something glorious, just like he did that old rugged cross. And I'll talk about that. Old rugged cross. It's not called rugged in the Bible, is it? It's a wooden cross. And as I understand it, the way this song was first written, it was, I'll cherish the old wooden cross. But someone changed it to rugged, and so that fits. That's how we know the song, the old rugged cross. Why would we say it was rugged? Well, it wasn't old when Jesus was on there. It was a new cross, no doubt. It wasn't an old cross. Now it's old. Is it rugged? I don't know how rugged the cross would be or what comes to your mind when you think of rugged, but I think of something that can take the blows, and it's tough and it's enduring. And that old rugged cross was an old rugged Savior hanging on that cross. He did it and now we preach. It's an old rugged gospel we preach because of that cross. It's tough. It's enduring. It's been abused, but it endures, doesn't it? The old rugged cross. Well, the history of this is kind of interesting, and I've got some of that here in the bulletin. If you turn 645, George Bernard, 1913. That's 100 years ago when the song was written, isn't it? 1913. And now, well, 110 years ago. 110 years ago now. 2023, so over 100 years ago. And George Bernard wrote that. I got a little bit about him in the bulletin, and we're not sure where he wrote it or where it was first sung. Different places make that claim. Here is a historical marker in Albion, Michigan. And you couldn't read the marker very well, so I wrote it out here. It says, the Old Rugged Cross, one of the world's best loved hymns. In fact, I read somewhere else This is number 2 in the top charts of the 10 best beloved hymns. Amazing Grace being number 1. This one would be number 2. Okay? So, it was composed here. Now, this is Albion, Michigan, by the Reverend George Bernard, and he gives the dates he lived. The son of an Ohio coal miner, Bernard was a lifelong servant of God, chiefly in the Methodist ministry. He wrote the words and music of over 300 other hymns, and none achieved the fame of the old rugged cross, the moving summation of his faith. Now, that's what that historical marker says. Here's the house where they said it used to stand, where that historical marker is, and they say he was living as a tenant in that house. He didn't own the house, but he was evidently renting a room there and living there. There's the picture of the old fella, that George, that wrote the hymn. But that's not the only marker up there. There's another place you can go in Michigan at Pokagon. Now, that's not Pokemon, okay? That's not Pokemon. That's Pokagon, Michigan. And they have a little church building there, First Methodist Episcopal Church. They say, no, this is where he wrote it. And this is where they first sung it. He was preaching in a meeting there, and he wrote it during that meeting, or at least he finished it here, and this is the first place it was sung. But there's another place in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. There's another church. This is called the Old Rugged Cross Church. They say, no, that's not where it was. It was here at this Friends Church. He had come over and visited a Friends Church. And this is where he finally finished the song. And when the first time a church sang it together was here at this Friends Church. Well, I bet there's a little bit of truth to all of this, where it come from. He probably worked on it several places and may have sung it one way, one place, and another way at another. But it's interesting, isn't it, that great hymn, there's different voices about where it was. The ambiguity about the origin of that song, let's let that this morning represent to us the ambiguity we have about where was Calvary? Where was this hill far away? Where is Golgotha? Now here's the text. Each of the Gospels write about this. Matthew 27:32 through 35. And as they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. They compelled him to bear the cross. And when they were come to a place called Golgotha, that is to say, the place of a skull, they crucified him. Mark says it this way, Mark 15:20 through 25. And when they had mocked him and led him out to crucify him, they compelled one Simon, a Cyrenian, who passed by coming out of the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. And they bring him to the place of Golgotha, which is being interpreted the place of a skull. And they crucified him. And here's what Luke says. And there were also 2 other malefactors led with him to be put to death. And when they were come to the place which is called Calvary, there they crucified him and the malefactors, one on the right hand, one on the left. And then here's what John says. And they delivered him therefore to be crucified, and they took Jesus and led him away, and he, bearing his cross, went forth into a place called the place of the skull, which is called in the Hebrew Golgotha, where they crucified him. Now they all know where it was. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they all knew where it was, and they write about it as though others would know when they mention this place, they'd know where it was. Here's what they say in summary. Let's look at this. Golgotha. Golgotha means skull. That's just the meaning of the word. It is a Hebrew word. Now, this is not the Old Testament Hebrew. that this is the Hebrew. It probably might be better to call that the Aramaic. This is what the common people spoke to one another in the land of Israel at that time, which is in the same family of languages that the Old Testament was written in, but the language had changed enough where it really wasn't the same language. They used the same alphabet. That's what it's talking about, the Hebrew. The common people that just lived there called it Golgotha. That means the place of a skull. Now, why would it be called the place of a skull? And again, there's all kind of ideas. The Bible never tells us. It's like you read that and say, well, they must have known why it was, but they didn't explain it to us, why it's called the place of a skull. Now, some will say it's called the place of a skull because they found a skull there. And there is a legend that it was Adam's skull. Now, the Bible doesn't say that, and how they would ever know, oh, this must have been Adam here. I don't know how they can come up. People love to create their own myths and legends and add that to the Bible, and people get that confused sometimes with what the Bible really says. It never calls it Adam's skull. There's another reason. They say, well, it looked like a skull in the side of the rocks. When the sun shone on the rocks just right, it kind of looked like there was a skull looking at you there. And I'll show you a picture of that in just a minute. Another said, well, it's shaped like a skull. We don't know why it was called the place of a skull. Another likely explanation, though, it's because it was a place of execution. They'd execute people by crucifixion, by stoning, and by beheading. And so just a place of execution here. It's got that name of a skull. It's ominous sounding, isn't it? Now, it's called Calvary. Luke, Calvary. That's just the word skull. In fact, beginning with the American Standard Version, you don't read about Calvary in the Bible. It just says a place which is called the skull. That's what it will say. And most modern versions will just translate that word. Calvary is a Latin word. There's a fellow named Jerome, and in the little town of Bethlehem, he took the Greek New Testament and translated it into Latin. And that was kind of the official Bible for the Western world for many, many years. And he used a Latin word that meant cranium. Well, that's the top of your head here, cranium. And that's why people say, well, maybe it was shaped like the top of a head, cranium. And so he used that word that the English translators go to that Latin word and bring the word Calvary in here. It's the Greek word for skull. Now, I could not think of a hymn that had skull in it. There's some hymns not very familiar with. You might find some that talk about Golgotha, but most of our hymns use the word Calvary, don't they, when they're talking about that place. But notice it says it's a place. Everyone called it a place. No one calls it a hill. We often sing about that hill far away. It may have been a hill. And some say Jesus was crucified up on top of the hill. Well, maybe he was. But it might not have been a hill. It may have been down at the base of a hill instead of at the top of a hill. These are the ambiguities about the place that we can't be sure of. The most important thing, though, is what took place there, isn't it? Not all these details that come to us. But we usually think of Jesus being crucified up on a rounded hilltop, up on top of the hill. Maybe so, but the Bible doesn't actually say that. Here's what it tells us about where it was. John 19:20. The place where Jesus was crucified was nigh to the city. So it's close to Jerusalem. We know that. Another thing, they that passed by reviled him, wagging their heads. They that passed by railed on him, wagging their heads. Matthew 27:39 and 15:29. So it was a place where people would pass by. That's why some people think, no, it wouldn't have been up on top of a hill. There was a sign over Jesus' cross that you wouldn't have been able to read if it's far up on the hill. It's down here where people would walk right by it, going in and out of the city. So on a major road coming in and out of Jerusalem, Jesus was crucified where people would pass by. It also tells us this, that it was outside the city. And that's because there were some sacrifices that were burnt outside the camp when the children of Israel were in the wilderness. And in Hebrews 13:11 through 13, it says, Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered without the gate. They didn't kill people inside the city walls. They took him outside the city and crucified him there. But where that place is, here's what happened. After Jesus was crucified, they continued to build around Jerusalem, and they expanded the walls beyond where they were between the time he was crucified, about AD 30 to 35, till AD 70. A lot of building had taken place in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was a larger city in those 35 years than it was when Jesus was crucified. And some say the city extended out and actually encompassed now this part where Jesus was crucified. It was outside when he was crucified. He was inside by the time Jerusalem was destroyed. But once Jerusalem was destroyed, they leveled that city. And so much so that Jesus said it won't be one stone left upon another. And then the Syrians moved in, and they hated the Jews and tried to destroy everything associated with the Jews that was in Jerusalem. And then Hadrian, the king, the empire, the Roman emperor Hadrian, he came and built a temple to Jupiter in that city with a statue to the Aphrodite, and erected that in the city of Jerusalem. And then later, that was destroyed. And then Constantine's mother. Now, Constantine was the emperor that adopted Christianity. His mother, the Welsh, say that she was from the British Isles. And she made it to Jerusalem, and she's in her 70s, or 80s, I think, maybe in her 80s. She was looking for artifacts. Well, you know, when someone important like that shows up and they're looking for something, you show it to them, don't they? They found all kind of Christian. They found the sign that was on Jesus' cross, showed it to her. They found 3 crosses. Well, which one was it? Which one of these crosses was it Jesus was crucified on? Well, they went up and tried to heal somebody, and one of them healed somebody, so that must be the one. That's the one. And they were showing her all kind of stuff. They said, not only that, we know where he was crucified. They said Hadrian built that temple right over the crucifixion site, and it's over the tomb. It's also over the tomb where the garden was. Now, if you go there was a garden near. Look, John 19. The place where he was crucified, there was a garden. And in the garden, a new sepulchre wherein no man had ever been laid. There laid they Jesus because of the Jews' preparation, for the sepulchre was nigh at hand. So there was this place of execution, and right close to it was a garden where they had a sepulchre, and it wasn't far to take Jesus from the cross right over to that garden next to it, to the sepulchre. Well, where would that be? Could you find that? I'll tell you, in destroying and rebuilding that city, they did all kinds of excavations, digging out new rocks, changing the landscape, filling up valleys, leveling the hills. How do you know where the place was? If you go there today, you'll find this church. This is not the church that Constantine's mother built. Her church was destroyed, and this one was rebuilt on that spot. This church has 2 domes. It's called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's built over the place Hadrian had built his temple. And that big dome there, under that big dome, is where they think the sepulchre may have been. And they think they've got the floor of that sepulchre. Now, all the stones around it are gone, but they think they found the floor where that sepulchre was. And then that small dome, they think, now that's over the hill where Jesus was crucified. There's a little cross over the small dome, and so they built a church over it. And for about 1,700 years now, that's been the traditional place of Calvary. But that's not the only place. There's other suggestions. When we were there, we visited what's called the Garden Tomb. And there's another tomb there that certainly does illustrate what must have happened to Jesus. But near that Garden Tomb, you can look over at this bluff. And if you look at that bluff just right, they say that looks like a skull. Now, they say it doesn't look as much like a skull as it used to because they've removed some stones off that bluff and building things around Jerusalem. But they say that's why it was called Place of a Skull. It looked like a skull is up on top of that hill or at the base of that hill, just another site. There's some other sites people suggest maybe that's where Jesus was crucified, and we don't really know where. Here's what we know. On a hill far away, if it was a hill, but in this place far away, there was the fulfillment of prophecy. Genesis 3:15. I'll put enmity between thee and the woman, and thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Genesis 22:2. Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee to the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering. Exodus 12. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. Numbers 21:9. Moses made a serpent of brass and put it on a pole, and it came to pass, if a serpent had bitten any man, when he beheld the serpent of brass, he lived. Psalm 22. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? They shake the head, saying, he trusted the Lord, he would deliver him. Let him deliver him, saying he delighted in him. They pierced my hands and my feet. They parted my garments among them and cast lots on my vesture. Isaiah 53. He's despised and rejected of man. He hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes were ye healed. And the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. He opened not his mouth. He made his grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death. He shall see the travail of his soul, and shall be satisfied, for he shall bear their iniquities. And he was numbered with the transgressions, and bare the sins of many. And he made intercession for the transgressors. I have a book at home called The Voices of Calvary, where David Farr, the preacher that's now departed, he wrote about things said leading up to the cross. The Jews that had arrested Jesus, that covered his face and smote him, and then they said, prophesy, who is he that smote thee? The words of Pilate. Pilate had a lot to say before the crucifixion. Art thou king of the Jews? I'm a Jew, thine own nation and chief priests have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? What is truth? I find no fault in him at all. John 19, Pilate says, speakest thou not unto me? Knowest thou not that I have power to crucify thee and power to release thee? And then he spoke to the Jews and said, behold your king. And they said, away with him, him, crucify him. Pilate said, shall I crucify your king? They answered Pilate, we have no king but Caesar. Matthew 27, 39 through 44. As he's hanging on that cross, they mocked him, saying, thou that destroyed the temple and buildest it in 3 days, save thyself if thou be the Son of God. Come down from the cross. He saved others, himself he cannot save. If he be the King of Israel, let him come down now from the cross. We'll believe him. He trusted God. Let him deliver him now, if he will have him. For he said, I'm the Son of God. And then the thief, if thou be Christ, save thyself and us. But the other thief said, dost not thou fear God, seeing thou art in the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man hath done nothing amiss. Lord, remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom. And then the centurion, Matthew 27, 54. This is the centurion that put him to death. Truly, this was the Son of God. But then there's the words of Jesus from the cross. Let me go over the 7 words from the cross. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Luke 23, 43. Verily I say unto thee, the day thou shalt be with me in paradise. That's to the thief. Notice how the agony of these words, you can tell he's dying. Notice what he says next. You can just tell in the order of these words. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That's the Hebrew. He's quoting from the 22nd Psalm. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? He's thinking about his mother. Mary was right there before the cross. And the disciple John, woman, behold thy son. Behold thy mother. I thirst. There was a man on that cross. He bore the infirmities of our flesh. The centurion was right. This was the Son of God, but this was the Son of God that had become a man. I thirst. John 19:30, it is finished. He had come to this earth and did what he intended to do. He fulfilled those prophecies and made propitiation for our sins. Now it's accomplished. It is finished. And then he took one more breath. And it says he cried out with a loud voice, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And that's where the text says he gave up the ghost. And so for 100 years we've sung this song, haven't we? On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. But I love that old cross where the dearest and best for a world of lost sinners was slain. So I'll cherish the old rugged cross. Till my trophies at last I lay down, I'll cling to the old rugged cross and exchange it someday for a crown. Have you taken up the cross? Your shameful life can be glorious if you'll come to Jesus and meet him at the cross. He died to turn shame into glory. If you've not responded to the gospel and been baptized into Christ, you can do that as we sing this song about the old rugged cross.